It's good to be back with you. And if you're watching this right now, you can probably feel it. We've crossed a line where politics stops being something on the news and starts showing up in grocery bills, gasoline prices, remittances, shipping routes, and the simple question every family asks at night: what happens next? Because after the detention of Nicolás Maduro, an event reported as a U.S. operation on January 3rd, 2026, followed by his transfer to the United States, everything around Venezuela's economy, and a surprising amount around the United States economy, becomes less about ideology and more about mechanics, about pipelines and ports, about sanctions and licenses, about debt, currency, legitimacy, and the price of risk. Encyclopedia Britannica. Now, before we go one step further, let's set one rule for this whole analysis. I'm not here to sell you a fantasy. I'm not here to tell you that one arrest magically fixes a country or magically breaks it. Economies don't work like fairy tales. They work like systems, and systems react to shocks in patterns. The biggest mistake people make in moments like this is to think in slogans instead of incentives. Slogans are loud, incentives are real. So what's the real shock here? It's not only the detention itself, it's what it signals to markets, a sudden and violent change in the probability of different futures. In other words, it's not just what happened, it's what investors, households, banks, and trading partners now believe could happen next week, next month, and next year. And that change in belief, whether you call it confidence, fear, credibility, or uncertainty, can move billions of dollars faster than any speech ever could. Here's the promise I'll make to you. If you stay with me through the full chain of logic, I'll give you a clear map of what is most likely to happen to inflation, oil, sanctions, jobs, the Venezuelan currency situation, migration pressures, and the hidden consequences in the United States, from energy markets to enforcement costs to political risk premiums. And at the end, I'll tell you the single variable that matters more than all the rest, the one thing that decides whether this becomes a reset or a longer crisis. Let's begin where the world begins, with Venezuela. Oil. Venezuela is not poor because it lacks resources. It is poor because it has been trapped, economically and institutionally, in a long war between what it could produce and what its system allows it to produce. In most countries, oil is an engine. In Venezuela, oil has been a battlefield. After the detention of Maduro, the immediate market question becomes: who controls the levers of the state oil system now, and under what legal authority? Because oil output is not just oil, it's spare parts, skilled labor, diluent, insurance, tankers, refining capacity, contract enforcement, and above all, payment rails. How money actually moves through the world without getting frozen. In the days after the detention, reporting points to intensified U.S. action around Venezuela-linked oil shipments, including legal moves and seizures aimed at control of cargoes and vessels tied to sanctioned trade networks. Reuters. That matters because if the enforcement environment tightens, even buyers who want the oil may not want the risk. Shipping is not heroic, it's cautious. It goes where it can be insured. So the first effect on Venezuela's economy is a short-term squeeze. Uncertainty spikes, the risk premium rises, and the cost of doing anything cross-border goes up. When the cost of moving money and goods rises, a country doesn't just slow down, it fragments. The formal economy weakens and the informal economy grows because the informal economy is the system's way of routing around obstacles. This is why, in the first phase, you could see a strange combination: headlines about change and opportunity, while ordinary people experience higher friction, more shortages in some channels, more volatility in prices, more opportunistic middlemen, and more anxiety about what currency is safe to hold. Now, does this mean Venezuela is doomed? Not necessarily, but it does mean the transition period is where most damage can happen if institutions fail to coordinate. Because the second major mechanism is sanctions and legal status. Even in the most optimistic scenario, sanctions do not evaporate just because a leader is detained. Legal and compliance frameworks move slowly, and companies that have been burned by Venezuela risk in the past will not rush back because of one dramatic headline. In fact, legal analysis circulating right now emphasizes that U.S. sanctions and compliance obligations can remain restrictive even after a political turning point, because the designation of the government of Venezuela and state-linked entities is not automatically reversed by a single event. J.D. Supra. That detail matters for Venezuela's next 12 months more than most people realize. Why? Because without predictable sanction relief, you don't get the scale of investment required to rebuild production. You might get opportunistic flows. You might get limited licensed operations. But the deep rebuild, the multi-year capital injection, technology transfer, and service company return depends on clear rules. And clear rules require a clear political authority inside Venezuela and a clear legal posture outside it. So the third mechanism is legitimacy. If Venezuela quickly produces a widely recognized transitional authority that can credibly commit to contracts, budget discipline, and an orderly security environment, the economic upside is real. You could see the beginning of a re-entry story, stabilization, gradual normalization, and selective capital returning. But if the country fractures, if competing factions claim authority, if security becomes unstable, if the bureaucracy splits, then the detention becomes not a door opening, but a floor collapsing. Investors don't fear poverty, they fear chaos, because chaos makes forecasting impossible, and forecasting is the mother of investment. Now let's talk about what this means for ordinary Venezuelans in practical terms: inflation, currency, wages, and basic goods. Venezuela's inflation story has never just been about prices rising. It has been about trust collapsing. When trust collapses, people stop using the local currency as a store of value. They run to alternatives: dollars, goods, anything. That creates a feedback loop. The weaker the currency, the faster people flee it. The faster they flee it, the weaker it gets. After Maduro's detention, there are two plausible short-term currency outcomes. Outcome 1, stabilization, hopes strengthen, and people temporarily reduce their panic demand for dollars. If a credible transition appears quickly, you can actually see a psychological improvement that reduces the speed of currency flight. That can slow inflation at the margin, not because the country suddenly produces more, but because expectations stop spiraling. Inflation is partly an expectations disease. Outcome 2, uncertainty overwhelms hope, and people accelerate their demand for hard currency and goods, fearing a power struggle, new controls, or financial disruptions. In that case, you can get a short, sharp inflation flare, even without new money printing, just from panic behavior, supply disruptions, and the collapse of pricing confidence. In both outcomes, the key is whether policy becomes predictable. And this is where many transitions fail: the temptation to do something fast. A transitional authority, if it forms, will face intense pressure to cap prices, to freeze exchange rates, to punish speculators, to control trade, to command stability into existence. That temptation is understandable. People are suffering. Politics demands action, but economics punishes shortcuts. Price controls don't create abundance, they create shortages. Exchange rate pegs without reserves don't create confidence, they create black markets. And a crackdown on private coping mechanisms doesn't increase trust, it destroys it. So if you want a simple rule, the fastest way to make Venezuela's post-detention economy worse is to try to force stability through coercion rather than rebuilding credibility through consistent rules. Now let's switch perspectives to the United States, because many people miss this. The US economy is not a passive observer here. It is an active participant, and participation has costs and consequences. Start with energy. You might assume Venezuela's oil is too small to matter to the US. It's not that simple. Global oil prices are set at the margin. Disruptions or enforcement actions that affect flows, shipping, or perceived supply security can move price expectations, and price expectations move futures. Futures influence spot prices, and spot prices influence what you pay at the pump and what companies pay for transport. Reuters reporting indicates the US has moved to tighten control over Venezuelan oil trade through legal actions targeting vessels and shipments, which signals a more interventionist posture around supply chains. Reuters. That can create a short-term tightening effect, even if the long-term goal is orderly control. If prices rise, it's not just drivers who feel it. It's airlines, it's shipping, it's food distribution, it's any business where energy is an input. That creates a mild inflationary push in the US, especially if combined with broader global uncertainty. But there's also a possible opposite effect over time. If the post-detention reality eventually produces a sanction-to-license transition and brings more Venezuelan supply into more transparent channels, global supply expectations can rise, which can moderate oil prices. Notice the timeline: short-term volatility, medium-term clarity, long-term supply response, if and only if the political and legal framework becomes predictable. Second US mechanism: enforcement and legal risk. When the U.S. intensifies sanctions enforcement, blockades, seizures, and legal proceedings around shipping and trade, that is not free. It is a resource commitment. It requires intelligence, naval presence, legal processing, diplomatic management, and domestic political bandwidth. Reuters describes an expanded U.S. push involving court warrants and actions aimed at vessels tied to Venezuela-linked oil flows. Reuters, IBOT. Those costs don't usually show up as a line item in your grocery receipt. They show up as strain in institutions and trade-offs in federal priorities. Third U.S. mechanism, migration and labor markets. Transitions in Venezuela can influence migration flows quickly. If Venezuelans believe conditions will improve, migration pressure can ease over time. If they fear instability or retaliation, it can intensify. The U.S. has already been grappling with politically explosive legal disputes around Venezuelan deportations and broader policy, highlighting how Venezuela-related events spill into U.S. domestic systems. The Washington Post. Migration affects the U.S. economy in both directions. It can increase labor supply and entrepreneurship, while also stressing local services and triggering political conflict that changes fiscal priorities. Now, let's assemble these pieces into a realistic timeline of how the economy changes in both countries after Maduro's detention. Phase 1. The shock window, roughly the first 30 to 90 days. In Venezuela, the shock window looks like this: volatility in prices, especially for imported essentials, stress in payment systems, a scramble for dollars and goods, and a spike in uncertainty premiums. Even people who are hopeful will hedge. Businesses will shorten their planning horizon, employers will delay hiring, importers will demand cash up front. Credit disappears first because credit depends on trust. At the same time, you could also see pockets of relief behavior. If some people believe the worst is over, they spend, they repair, they restock, they try again. That can create a misleading burst of activity. But unless the institutional picture becomes clear, that burst fades. In the United States, Phase 1 looks like market noise and political noise, energy headlines, sanctions enforcement headlines, and diplomatic shockwaves. U.S. consumers may notice price sensitivity if oil markets wobble. Companies with Venezuela exposure will freeze decisions until legal guidance is clearer. Phase 2, the institutional window, roughly 3 to 12 months. This is where the story is decided. If Venezuela forms a transitional authority with enough control to enforce basic security, stabilize the payment environment, and negotiate internationally, then you can get a stabilization path. Inflation slows, trade channels normalize, and the economy begins to reform from the ground up. But stabilization is not growth. Stabilization is simply when the bleeding stops. Growth comes later, and it comes from production, not slogans. Production requires investment. Investment requires contracts. Contracts require courts, and courts require legitimacy. That is the ladder. And here is the uncomfortable truth. In Venezuela, the ladder has been missing rungs for years. You can't rebuild it in one quarter, but you can start by making rules predictable. In this phase, sanctions and licensing become the central external variable. The post-detention environment is already being described in legal and commercial terms as a complex landscape involving sanctions, sovereign assets, and compliance constraints, which tells you how economics after Maduro is not simply a domestic issue. It's a cross-border legal architecture problem. MacArthur and English, LLP. So what changes in Venezuela's economy if things go well in this institutional window? First, the exchange rate can become less chaotic. Not strong necessarily, but less chaotic. When people believe tomorrow will not be worse than today, they stop stampeding into hard currency. That alone can reduce the speed of price increases. Second, local production can revive in small ways. People return to normal risk-taking, opening shops, stocking inventory, repairing equipment. Those micro-decisions matter more than grand national plans. Third, the diaspora can begin sending more purposeful remittances, not just survival money, but investment money, repairs, small businesses, education. That's how transitions often get funded, by citizens who live abroad and have access to stable currency. Fourth, oil revenue can begin to re-enter more formal channels, if sanctions allow it, meaning the state can fund services more predictably. But this is where many transitions self-destruct. They treat oil revenue as a shortcut. They spend too early, they hire too fast, they build patronage networks, and they recreate the same disease with a different label. The right move in a fragile recovery is boring. Stabilize, rebuild credibility, and avoid commitments you can't fund. What changes in the U.S. economy in this phase? If Venezuelan oil supply begins to look more reliable and more transparent, it can reduce supply risk premiums in global oil markets, slightly moderating energy inflation. It can also create selective opportunities for U.S. service companies, engineering, logistics, and legal services. But again, opportunity is conditional on legal clarity. Without it, big firms stay cautious. Also, if Venezuela stabilizes, migration pressure can ease over time. That can reduce political strain in the US and lower the temperature of certain domestic policy fights. Phase 3. The rebuild window, roughly 1 to 5 years. This is where the word growth becomes real or remains a mirage. For Venezuela to grow meaningfully, three things must happen together. One, macro stabilization, predictable fiscal policy, no reckless monetary expansion, and a credible commitment to letting markets price goods without coercive distortions. Two, micro reforms, property rights, contract enforcement, reduction of arbitrary seizures, and a business environment where people can plan. Three, integration, a clear relationship with international financial systems so that money can come in and out without fearing it will be frozen, confiscated, or politicized. Oil can finance parts of this, but only if it is managed with restraint and transparency. Otherwise, oil becomes what it has always been, a magnet for corruption, a shortcut that delays reforms, and a political weapon. If Venezuela achieves those three elements, the changes for ordinary people are profound. Wages begin to matter again. Savings becomes possible. Long-term planning returns. Basic goods become reliably available, not because of distribution, but because supply chains regain confidence. If Venezuela fails those three elements, the post-detention economy can become a more chaotic version of the past. Factional power struggles, shifting controls, and a permanent gray zone economy where the most productive people either leave or hide. Now let's go deeper into the most specific question your title asks. How will the economy change in the United States and Venezuela? For Venezuela, the most immediate change is not GDP. It's the structure of incentives. Under a system dominated by arbitrary controls and political allocation, the best strategy for many people is not productivity, it's proximity to power. That's how economies rot. After a regime shock, there is a brief moment where incentives can reset, where productivity becomes rational again because rules become more predictable. So, the economic changes in Venezuela, in plain language, are likely to be more price volatility in the short run, followed by either stabilization or a deeper fragmentation depending on governance, a potential reorganization of the oil trade, less shadow activity if enforcement remains intense, and potentially more licensed, supervised channels if international policy shifts. Reuters. A surge in informal commerce during uncertainty, because people will always trade to survive. A higher premium on hard currency and goods as stores of value until confidence is rebuilt. A psychological shift. If people believe the system will punish saving and reward political access, they will stay defensive. If they believe the system will reward effort and respect property, they will invest in their own future. For the United States, the changes are subtler but real. Energy price sensitivity in the short term due to uncertainty and enforcement actions around Venezuelan supply chains, with possible moderation later if transparent supply rises. Reuters. Higher institutional and enforcement costs if the U.S. maintains an active role in controlling or supervising Venezuelan oil flows, with legal complexity for companies dealing with compliance. MacArthur and English LLP. Domestic political spillover connected to Venezuela-related migration, deportations, and legal battles, which can shift policy priorities and public spending focus. The Washington Post. Now let's talk about the story inside the story. Technology and the new shape of power. Even if Venezuela stabilizes politically, it will still face the modern economic reality. Capital is mobile, labor is partially mobile, and trust is the ultimate asset. In 2026, you don't just compete with neighboring countries. You compete with a teenager in another continent who can sell services online. You compete with automation. You compete with AI that lowers the cost of knowledge work. That is both a threat and an opportunity. It is a threat because old institutions that rely on gatekeeping, licenses, monopolies, bureaucratic bottlenecks become even more damaging when the world moves faster. It is an opportunity because if Venezuela opens space for entrepreneurship, the diaspora plus technology becomes a growth engine. Remote work, digital services, cross-border commerce, these can grow even when heavy industry is slow to rebuild, but only if the rules allow it. Now here's the variable I promised. The one that decides whether this becomes a reset or a longer crisis. It is not oil. It is not even sanctions. It is not the personality of any leader. It is institutional credibility. Credibility is the invisible infrastructure. When credibility exists, people lend, invest, build, and plan. When credibility collapses, people hoard, flee, short-sell the future, and treat every promise as a trap. After Maduro's detention, Venezuela is standing in a rare moment where credibility could be rebuilt, but it will not be rebuilt by speeches. It will be rebuilt by consistent actions, letting prices move, protecting property, enforcing contracts, and refusing the temptation to buy short-term calm with long-term ruin. And for the United States, credibility matters too, but in a different way. Credibility in legal consistency, in predictable policy, and in the ability to manage international shocks without destabilizing its own domestic systems. So if you want the cleanest takeaway, it's this. In Venezuela, the economy will change first in behavior, then in markets, then in living standards. People will shift from survival tactics to productive tactics only when they believe the rules have changed for real. In the United States, the economy will change first in margins, energy, enforcement costs, and political spillover, then potentially in broader market confidence if the region stabilizes and supply chains become more predictable. And now, let me end with a final thought that sounds simple, but carries the whole weight of history. Detaining a leader can remove a symbol, but only institutions can remove a system. If institutions rise, courts, predictable rules, transparent finance, protected rights, then Venezuela can begin the long, difficult climb back toward normal economic life, and the United States can see reduced regional instability over time. If institutions fail, then the detention becomes just another dramatic moment in a cycle where power changes hands, but the incentives stay rotten. So watch the boring signals, not the loud ones. Watch whether contracts are honored. Watch whether property is protected. Watch whether prices are allowed to speak. Watch whether the rules apply to friends and enemies alike. Because that's how you'll know whether this is the beginning of recovery or simply the opening act of the next crisis. And one last note, this is analysis, not personal financial advice. Your decision should be grounded in your own situation, your own risks, and the laws where you live. If you want, I can rewrite this in a more documentary narrator style, slower, more cinematic, more suspense, or more economist lecture style, tighter logic, denser reasoning, still without titles and still ready to narrate. https www.britannica.com. Question: why was Venezuelan President Nicolás Maduro captured by the US in 2026? UTM source: ChatGPT. Why was Venezuelan President Nicolás Maduro captured? https www.reuters.com. Business: Energy US files warrants, sees dozens more Venezuela-linked oil tankers. Sources say 2026-01-33. UTM source at ChatGPT. US files for warrants to seize dozens more Venezuela-linked oil tankers. Sources say. 3. https www.jdsupra.com. Legal news. Implications of the arrest of Nicholas 686,070. UTM or source yes ChatGPT. Implications of the arrest of Nicolás Maduro for US OFAC. https www.washingtonpost.com. DCMD V 2026 Jolawanta 13 Rubio Venezuela Immigration Bosberg. UTM source ChatGPT. Rubio says court hearings no longer possible for deported Venezuelans. Shiori https www.macarthur.com. Insights. Venezuela after Maduro. Key legal and commercial considerations for U.S. companies and investors. UTM source ChatGPT. Venezuela after Maduro. Key legal and commercial